Okay, thank you. So it is really cold out and unpleasant today, so we're going to go somewhere nice and warm, not exactly tropical, but warm and sunny. So we're going to the Peruvian coast. So the group that I'll be talking about today is called the Moche, not mocha, Moche. And my guess is that this is probably a culture that most of you have not heard of yet. A few of you, perhaps. So it's going to be new ground. But I think that you're going to have a lot of fun today because, in a few words, the Moche were really crazy. Today we're going to see sex and violence and lots of gold everywhere. So, probably if the Moche, if someone made a movie about the Moche, it would not even meet a PG qualification. So hopefully this is going to be a lot of fun. And the Moche are one of the cultures that has been studied. Their archaeology began very recently, really in the 1980s or so, and since then it has proliferated, and by now we know a very, very good amount about the Moche culture, similar maybe to the Inca, and much more than many other groups of South America or of the ancient New World. So, last week when I was talking about the Inca, I introduced this distinction in the ancient Andes between the high Andes, the highlands, so down here, very high altitudes. On the map, you see the spine of orange running down Peru. And then on the other hand, another important area is the coast. So we're talking about this very narrow strip that runs along the Pacific Ocean. It's not very wide. And so we're going to be talking about the north part of this today. So the north coast is what the region is normally called. Lima is right in here, so everything north of Lima, pretty much. Okay, so the north coast of Peru, really the whole coast of Peru, is among one of the driest areas in the world, actually. So this is basically just a desert environment we're talking about. To the extent, is this too close? To the extent that it actually has these huge sand dunes like the Sahara, which are not much fun to walk over when you're doing research out there. So a very, very dry climate here. And this presents a lot of natural challenges. As I mentioned last week, this is actually part of a much longer desert strip that runs the entire length of the Pacific coast of South America, so running from Peru all the way down to Chile. And then once you get into Chile, the Atacama Desert is literally the driest desert in the entire world. So most years there is virtually no rainfall at all that falls the entire length of the year. We're talking an order of like 2 centimeters for the whole year. Moisture does come in the form of this fog. The Spanish word is la garua. And if any of you have been to Lima before during their winter time, during our summer months, you have most likely seen this very gloomy, depressing scene. This is what Lima looks like because it's covered by this fog. It's called the garua. And here you see the fog moving up into the highlands as it comes off the ocean and moves upward. So this fog is the main form of moisture that you get on the coast. It comes in every day. Then in the north coast area, we're talking about a little closer to the equator, it goes away by midday, and then the sun comes out, and it's bright and sunny. But it doesn't actually come as rain. And in some areas, different people living on the coast actually developed ways to kind of capture this moisture and use it to provide water for their plants. So most of the time it's very dry, except for when the El Nino event takes place here. So I think for most of us, we feel like we hear a little too much about the Nino and maybe are rather skeptical if this is even a real thing here. Everything nowadays seems to be El Nino, right? But in the Andes, El Nino is a very real thing, and it's palpable. It's extremely destructive, so you know when it's happening. So I'm not an oceanographer or a meteorologist, so I can't give you all the details. But basically what the Nino is in the context of South America is off the coast of South America, randomly, I think every 10 to 12 years, no one knows exactly when it's coming, cold water, unusually cold water, comes to the surface, and then from there it kind of moves west. But when it comes to the surface, feel like I'm not hearing the mic. Are you guys, is it okay? Okay. Okay, so when it comes to the surface, it disturbs all of the normal ecosystem. The marine life change. You get different species coming to the top, and the fish actually move further from the coast too. So there are a lot of important changes that take place. Part of this is also massive flooding that comes in. So these huge rain events happen, and in many cases just wipe out the infrastructure of the coast. When it's an especially bad incident, you get just water in the streets, just massive mud everywhere. So these are very catastrophic, very disruptive events. So El Nino is definitely a real thing here. And in the past too, they played an important role in impacting agriculture, impacting the course of civilization. These were something that people had to grapple with. And they were something that was unpredictable. It wasn't like the rise and fall of a flood every year where you could work around that. So how do people support themselves in this desert environment? Your first guess, which is correct probably, is by fishing and by taking advantage of the great bounty of marine life that was in the Pacific coast. Peru actually has the richest fishery in the entire world, so there was an abundance of fish to take advantage of and other seafood. Anchovies were actually a big staple food, maybe not everyone's first pick, but they have a lot of other good species. Peru nowadays is kind of booming and becoming a presence on the global food scene, like high cuisine. A caveat there is most of the food that gets marketed as the best, the highlights of Peruvian food tends to be seafood that comes from the coast. The stuff that people are eating in the highlands, like the dried potatoes, that's not really part of that whole scene. That's my 2 cents worth. Anyway, but a delicious dish that would be representative of coastal cuisine is this dish called ceviche. It's actually fish or other seafood marinated in lime juice. Very, very good. I recommend that. It's raw, yeah. It's marinated in lime juice so that it kind of cooks it in a way. So fishing has been a big industry for thousands of years, and the earliest civilizations actually supported themselves by fishing rather than by growing crops. This kind of boat here, you still can see it in some places if you're lucky. It's a traditional kind of boat that fishermen have been using for thousands of years. I believe someone in the class mentioned last week that her daughter had done some research on these. They're called caballitos, which in Spanish is a little horse. So the fish, they're just a single person boat, and then the fisherman rides out and fishes in them into the deep water. Nowadays, most people are using boats like this. So the ocean was a great source of support and of food and other resources for the people that lived on the coast. But another important source of water that supported life were rivers. And the river valley was a very important feature of the geography of ancient Peru. So you get a kind of sense in this map. Along here is where the highlands run, where the high Andes run, and they're filled with glaciers and snowfall, and then water kind of pools up on the top when weather patterns come from the east. So the highlands are the source of water, so this is an important point that we're going to come back to later. And people on the coast recognize this. They realize that the rivers ran down from the high areas. So you've got the highlands, and then from here, a million little rivers just kind of come straight west and hit the coast at a perpendicular angle. Here you can see this on a satellite image, and you kind of see these stripes of green periodically. So people were able to harness the power of the rivers and build these very large canals, very complex interconnected systems that in some cases could span, dozens or hundreds of kilometers, to bring the water from the river valleys to dry land and then to raise their crops there. So the way it panned out in the end was that you get these clusters of population right around these river valleys, and then they're kind of separated by spans of desert. And this was a pattern of settlement that would continue even as civilizations rose and fall. You would get this pattern of human distribution on the land. So once you get the water to the desert, it's actually quite fertile, and it's full of many beneficial nutrients, and in fact, modern agribusiness has really taken a hold on much of the Peruvian coast. So when you drive up the Pan American Highway, a lot of the area looks like this. Asparagus in particular is a big export crop. If you go to the grocery store here and buy asparagus, it's likely that you'll see a grown in Peru sticker on it. Makes me very hungry when I'm down there seeing all that. So once you get water to the land, it actually becomes very, very productive. But the key here is to be able to work with this delicate environment and understand its drawbacks and its advantages and its necessities. So when something comes along like an El Nino event with the flooding, this can really throw things off. Okay. So we're going to get to the Moche in a little bit, but I want to do a little detour to another culture that you may have heard of at this point that has some similarities in common, which is the Nazca culture. So it flourished at a similar time period around 100 to 800 AD. The Nazca are most famous for these things called geoglyphs here, which you have no sense of the scale from these pictures, but these are actually etched in the ground surface, and they can be, a mile long. They're actually only visible from airplanes or from the air. So when you're walking on the ground, what you see is more like this here. And then they come in a range of shapes. Mostly they're animals like hummingbirds, a monkey, there's a spider, and a killer whale. So, I realize I'm belaboring the alien thing too much at this point, but this is actually one of the main sources where people have, specifically this one man, Eric von Däniken, proposed that these are evidence that, extraterrestrial people were involved in creating these civilizations, because how could people that lived here have been able to see these lines on the ground? How could they have made them? He published this in a very influential, well-known book called The Chariots of the Gods. I think it's from the 1960s, but I'm not sure. But in reality, I think we've seen by this point that Native American peoples had a lot of technological capacity. Look back on the Mayans, they invented the zero. They had some knowledge of surveying, like when I talked about the canals that were created to move the river water. Archaeologists have found what they think is surveying equipment. So they definitely had some kind of method to do this. And even just a simple grid system would help you create this on the ground. So we're not sure exactly how it was done, but it was definitely within their capacity. The actual technique that constitutes the Nazca lines is very simple. If you look under here, the desert surface, the ground is dark colored, and it's covered by all these small red rocks. So literally all you had to do is just scoot the rocks out of the way to make a permanent line on the ground. This is very fragile, though. This is not a permanent technique. If you're on the ground, it kind of looks more like this, more than the beautiful shape you see from the air. So what were these used for if they weren't actually alien landing pads here? We're not certain, but there are some good theories here. Many people think that they were related to sources of water, that they may have kind of pointed the way towards underground aquifers, or either been on top of them, that they were somehow related. I've talked about the desert and how precious water was and how in tune people were with understanding how to manage their environment. So this is one theory. Another theory is that they were used as pathways that organized ritual movement. So processions of religious leaders and people would move along here to commemorate certain things, possibly to tap into the power of these powerful natural animals, like the killer whale. One analogy that I thought of for this is that certain Christian denominations have these labyrinths on the ground, and walking along the labyrinth in certain patterns is a form of meditation to kind of connect the physical body and the spirit. So this is a kind of similar principle at work. So they might have been a pathway for ritual processions. Not yet decided yet, but archaeologists are definitely working on that right now. In general, the Nazca lines are a very powerful symbol of cultural patrimony for the nation of Peru. The coinage, the Peruvian Nuevo Sol, features the Nazca lines on the front of the coins. And because of this, the Nazca lines actually featured in the news a month or two ago because a group of Greenpeace activists came to the hummingbird geoglyph, and then they wrote down big letters, trying to promote awareness of climate change. This made a lot of people really angry because the lines are very fragile, and they in fact damaged the Nazca lines. So a lot of archaeologists saw this as a gross, and just general Peruvians, saw this as a gross lack of respect for this symbol of patrimony, and they are actually now being prosecuted by the Peruvian government. So Peru takes this quite seriously. So just as further evidence that the Nazca lines weren't just kind of out in the desert in the middle of nowhere, they're actually associated with this thriving culture on the southern coast of Peru. They made these large mud brick pyramids. They made one of the most beautiful traditions of pottery in the ancient New World with this very shiny surface and really colorful designs. Many of the animals that are represented in the geoglyphs and the Nazca lines actually appear in the pottery, so we do have that connection too. And then they also built these unusual spiraled aquifers to reach the underground water sources too. So the Nazca, had a lot of different cultural developments. We could have had a whole class about them, but we don't have time for that. I want to mention too, if you guys can keep this in your mind, the Anthropology department on campus has a small collection of Nazca pottery, just a small case about the size of this here. But you can see a number of the different vessels. If you're looking for that, that's in Garland Hall. So I think a garland, deck the halls, if you can remember that. Anyway, if you want to see that, they're over there. I didn't bring any here because I've been Oh no, this one's a replica, but these ones are real. It's a mini museum over there. So I'd recommend checking those out if you're interested. Okay, so let's move back north to the Moche. So again, here is Lima to orient you guys, those of you who have been to Peru. So the Nazca are just down here, south of Lima. So we're going to move up to this whole northern area where it's warmer, closer to the equator, very sunny for part of the year. Okay, so far I've talked about different kinds of political and social organization of these different cultures. So if you think back about thank you. So if you think back about the Inca, they were very centralized. They were truly an empire where there was the government in Cusco, and then they expanded and they incorporated all these provinces, and it was all organized into one big thing. The Maya, on the other hand, had different city-states, as it were, different small groups that were each independent, and they interacted between themselves. So if we can build an analogy here, the Moche are a little bit more like that. So they had a number of different political and ceremonial centers. Some might have been allied in kind of these two, like a more northern group and a southern group. But basically, these were all independently functioning centers. Remember, again, they had spans of desert between the river valleys. Okay, so archaeologists have excavated at a number of these centers by now, and they all have their own unique characteristics. The most famous of these is right outside the modern city of Trujillo. So here's Trujillo right here. It's one of the bigger cities in Peru. And this site is called Huaca de Moche, and specifically, specifically it's the home of these two large pyramids. So the word on the Peruvian coast for pyramid, for this kind of adobe pyramid, is huaca. And this comes from a Quechua word that means sacred or powerful. So early on, so for a long time, people have recognized these as sacred and powerful places. So the site of Huaca de Moche has two huacas. One is the Huaca de la Luna, the pyramid of the moon, and one is the Huaca del Sol, the pyramid of the sun. Now the Huaca del Sol is among the largest of the pyramids of the constructions of the ancient New World. There's actually, we're going to figure out as we go through this, North America, Mesoamerica, and South America all had cultures that built these platform mounds, either made of stone or earth, or in this case, of mud brick. So the Huaca del Sol is one of the biggest, I think the second biggest in the whole New World. It was made of approximately 130 million bricks of adobe, and originally it stood 160 feet high. So we're talking like a 15, 20-story building, something like that. And at one end of the site was this one, the Pyramid of the Sun. On the other side was the Pyramid of the Moon. This is the Pyramid of the Moon. And you can see very clearly here that there's this mountain behind it, and it kind of replicates this form of the mountain. So for many of these cultures that built these platforms, they were understood to represent mountains, human-built mountains, again echoing the sacred power of the landscape for many of these people. So between the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon was a very dense urban center. The people that lived here were not farmers. They were mostly artisans, urban people producing materials, producing fine goods for the Moche elites that lived at this site. Actually, let me point out too, this is the satellite view of Huaca del Sol. It kind of has this weird shape. It's definitely not a square, you can see. This is because when the Spanish came, they were realizing that gold and silver were coming out of these platform mounds, or out of these pyramids. So they actually created a hydraulic mine diverting a source of water to wash away 2/3 of the pyramid here to extract the gold. So they really saw it as just like a natural mine here. So we really only have a segment of what would have been a much larger structure originally up here. Okay, so that's Huaca de la Luna and Huaca del Sol. The Huaca del Sol, the Pyramid of the Sun, when archaeologists, so it looks they don't look very pretty because they're not made in stone like the Moche ones. They look kind of blobby, admittedly. But once you start digging inside, you can see all these bricks are very well preserved. So when archaeologists looked at these bricks up here, they noticed that each one of the bricks had a mark on it with a different kind of symbol, like an X or a diagonal line or a few dots or a handprint or something like that. And when they started comparing this to modern labor practices used to build public constructions in the modern Andes, they made an analogy, and they figured that each of these marks probably represents a different community, a different group who came and participated in the construction. So the mark represented that community and was kind of a form of accounting to keep track of who brought what bricks and how many people had filled their quota and so on. So it's kind of an early form of recording labor contributions. So the Huaca del Sol, we're not quite sure of its purpose. Huaca del Sol, the Pyramid of the Sun, sorry about that. We're not quite sure of its purpose because much of it has been washed away and it hasn't been intensively excavated yet. But the Pyramid of the Moon, on the other hand, has been the subject of intense ongoing excavations since around 2005 or so. And those people working here have uncovered some of the most well-preserved and spectacular murals of the ancient Americas here. So keep in mind, we're talking about 1,500 years old here, and they're still extremely brightly colored and very vivid.
Was there more than one Pyramid of the Moon? You said Huacas?
The Huacas refers to the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, the two pyramids. Yeah, I'm confusing the Spanish a bit. We're just talking about two of these pyramids, the Moon and the Sun one. So the one of the Moon is the one where these murals have been found. And they represent all kinds of ranks of human beings and deities too, as you go up this very large, impressive space. And you can see these little people down here for scale. So this was a big, open, powerful amphitheater, an important religious space. This guy here is the supreme god of the Moche, we think. So this is a very elaborate theater, a scene where important religious spectacles took place. Interestingly enough, another one of these sites, so we're talking completely different location, replicates in very great detail the layout and the artwork seen at the Pyramid of the Moon. So this site is called Huaca el Brujo, which means the Pyramid of the Sorcerer. Very dramatic here, and you can see it from above. So you see many of these same scenes here, and actually the layout of these two spaces is virtually identical. even though these sites are located in different river valleys. So what this probably signifies is that the groups at both of these locations both ascribe to the same kind of ideology, the same kind of beliefs about leadership and political systems, of governmental organization, and of the religious beliefs that underlay these forms of organization. So we might think, if you were an extraterrestrial and came to Earth and didn't know anything that you were looking at, if you went to Europe, you would see churches, and then here you would see churches, and they have the same layout, this kind of long form with an altar at one end. So the inference here would be that they were part of this bigger system of belief that corresponded to how it was expressed in architecture and in art. So this is an interesting discovery for archaeologists to find. And then there are a number of these other important sites. This one is further to the north, Pampa Grande, the big plain, I guess, was what that would translate to. This was perhaps a capital of a more northern confederation of Moche cities. It has this enormous pyramid here in the middle of the plain, and then you can see a wall running around here too. It's been, very weather beaten by El Nino events and so on, but it would have been quite large and impressive in its day too. Okay, so let's get to the exciting part here. That was exciting too, but this is cool. Okay, so Moche religion is very vivid and, like I said, a little bit crazy. So let's dig into this bit, because this was a very, very important part of Moche cities and Moche life. I feel like I've said the term ritual a million times, even already in this class. You may have noticed this, but this is just representative of a bigger takeaway point, is that before the modern period, throughout the world, religion was not only very much a part of people's lives, of everyone's lives on a daily basis, even more than it is for many people now, but it was also densely intertwined with politics. So for probably the majority of ancient peoples around the world, the basis of power of leaders was entangled in some way with religion and with their beliefs. So for the Moche, this was just as much the case as for the other people we've talked about. So I mentioned this guy before. This is what art historians and archaeologists believe was the primary deity of the Moche. And because the Moche language was still spoken when the Spanish came to Peru much later, we can actually link this guy with a particular name in the native language. This guy's name was Apayek, and he was a very fearsome deity. You can see his large teeth, his fangs, his big goggly eyes, and crazy hair too. So he was a god who was associated with decapitation. Okay, so this is going to be a little complex, so just bear with me here. Because this concept, this story here that we see laid out, is very much important to understanding Moche society and Moche beliefs too. So this one pottery here, this one vessel, is similar in form to this with the circle, and then this is called the stirrup spout at the top. This one pottery is kind of like a Rosetta Stone to Moche religion, and it's decorated with this scene here that has been called the presentation theme, because at the heart of it is the presenting of this goblet to this one personage. So the characters in this scene form a little story, a story in Moche mythology, we can assume. So let me lay out some of these people for you, because they're going to come back up later. So this guy I'd call the leader. He's the main figure. He has a big crown on, and he has rays coming out of his body. So he's an important figure. He's a deity. He's a lord. And he is being presented a goblet. Turns out it's a goblet full of human blood. By this guy who has a beak. He is the bird priest. That's his name. And he's got wings, too, on his back. And he also has a crown. So,
how old is this presentation? Like 1,000 years?
this is the same period, 100 to 800 AD. So we're talking about 1,500 years old, or more or less, give or take. So there's the bird priest, and he presents a goblet to the leader. Between them, we see this little dog. Over here is another character. This is a woman. She is identified as the priestess, and she is bringing the goblet up to the bird priest to give to the leader. And then you have a number of other characters in here, too. This is a throne, with rays on it, probably the throne of the leader. And then down here, there are these guys who are bound naked captives, and they're having their throats slit. So this is the story of the presentation theme. Okay, I'm gonna shock you here because this, in order to understand the significance of this, art historians have compared it to something you're not going to expect, the nativity scene in Western traditions. So how could this possibly be? So the idea here is that when we think of the nativity scene, there are all these figures that we know well. There's the shepherds and the magi. There's Mary and Joseph and Jesus. And when we look at Western art, you could go to any church or any museum, and if you see a scene with shepherds and a sheep, you'll realize, oh, this is part of this bigger narrative. This is representing the nativity, even though we only have a part of this scene. Same thing with the magi and a camel or so on. So the same thing happens in much of Moche art. You get little snippets of this story over and over again. So if you happen to see the priestess, you'll know that the artist representing the priestess on a particular pot or a particular mural was referring to this bigger mythological narrative. So this is going to come up again. So this was a central story in all of Moche religion. And you'll notice that it hinges on blood and on sacrifice and violence. So yeah, this would be a National Geographic style representation of the presentation theme. I have a soft spot for these kinds of dramatic drawings here. So you see that would be probably the leader decapitating a naked victim, and then this woman here at the corner is holding the goblet to collect the blood from the victim. And if you notice, these paintings here back in the backdrop represent those layers of the Pyramid of the Moon. But it's good because it kind of gets the drama, the spectacle involved in these very public ceremonies and these very richly decorated places. Can I ask you guys to just hold questions until the end, and I'll get back to you later. Okay, so we've talked about violence in a number of contexts, particularly with the Aztecs the first time. And violence, again, ritual violence for religious reasons was, again, at the heart of Moche culture and Moche politics, too. So over and over, you get representations of bound captives who are being sacrificed. So in pots, there's this guy with a rope around his neck. Here, and then again here, there's a line of naked captives being led on a kind of a pole between them. So ritual violence was understood. Again, we have to get back into how the Moche saw this and saw what the point of it was. A lot of it was about the circulation of fluids was understood as kind of at the heart of the reproduction of life on Earth. So blood was a sacred fluid, water was a sacred fluid, and in order for life as we know it to continue, these had to be spilled, and they had to be taken out as single individuals and shared with society as a whole. So as far as we can reconstruct it from iconography, from paintings and artwork, this is what we can tell was the Moche rationale for human sacrifice. Another part of this is that most of the sacrificial victims were men, and very clearly represented as such. And actually there's a real emphasis on genitals, probably because they're another source of life-giving liquid, being semen here, that was also understood as part of the circulation of the generation of fluids through the world. They were also victims of warfare too. So there was this masculine emphasis in Moche ritual violence. Back to the circulation of fluids, how I said that the Moche understood that their water sources came from the high mountains. So they saw the mountains as the ultimate sources of life and life-giving water. And in this vessel, very stylized representation, but these are probably meant to be mountain peaks. And this person, for instance, would be someone who has been sacrificed on the mountain peak. So we see this association between water coming from the mountains and between life. And we know that the sacrifices that the Moche carried out weren't just represented on artwork, they weren't just mythological, but they were things that actually really happened in real life. So, for instance, this is a set of sacrifice victims that has been found at the Pyramid of the Moon. Again, these were men, and probably not even being an expert, you can tell that these people are just kind of laid out helter-skelter. They weren't given a formal burial like a respected person would be. So they're victims. They were just thrown in here, too. These guys actually were buried in a layer of silt that probably came from a flooding episode, a very severe flooding episode that occurred late in the Moche period. So they might have been understood to be placating the gods in a way. Okay, so like I said, the Moche captured many of their victims through warfare. It's a very contentious issue, whether this was within the Moche culture, whether they're capturing and fighting different Moche groups, whether they were fighting foreigners, we just don't know. But we do have a lot of scenes of warriors and of battles. This is a representation of a warrior. They often have these big clubs, maces that they used in battle, and you see those again down here. And then they had very ornate regalia, just like the Aztecs did in their warfare. Let's skip over that. Okay, so we've seen religion, and let's get to the leaders and understand how they related to Moche religion. So remember this guy, the priest leader, the central character of the presentation theme. So with Moche culture, we're actually very fortunate because archaeologists have come literally face to face with the bones of many prominent rulers. And they've given us a very good idea of the nature of rulership and how this was understood among the Moche, which is very different from the cultures that we've studied so far. This is one leader here, and you can see he was buried with different people at the same time. So the most famous of these by far, and a find that really revolutionized archaeology in South America as a whole, was the discovery of the burial of the Señor de Sipan, this being the Lord of Sipan. Sipan is another one of these capital states here. And again, you can see it has this pyramid, this Huaca at the center of the site. So in the 80s, 1987, archaeologists were digging at this site, and they came upon this burial deep inside of a pyramid here, deep inside of the mud brick. And they found the burial of a Moche ruler. He was probably in his 40s when he was buried. And he was buried with massive, massive, massive amounts of gold and silver. There were several other people buried too. And I don't even know what this reconstruction was from. Google pulled this up. You can see this represents all of the gold that he would have worn on his formal occasions, all the gold that he was buried with. And then there were several other characters or burials who were also interred with massive amounts of gold ornaments too. So like there was this guy here, the main guy, several others too. And when you go to the city of Chiclayo, near where this was found, there's an entire museum, and we're not talking just a little museum, like a standard-sized museum, that pretty much just houses and displays all the gold that came out of this burial. And it has been compared to the King Tut's tomb of the New World, is what it's been called. Not sure why it's not more widely known in North America, but this really was a huge, very flashy discovery. So you can see some of these ornaments here, just beautiful, fine work with lapidary and filigree and so on. Just representations of marine life with these octopus tentacles. And then you get a sense of all the layers that went into just one person's burial. There are several of these rulers found in this tomb. But what excited archaeologists most, perhaps, was they discovered that the Señor de Sipan was buried with many of the features of that central guy in the presentation theme. So back to this guy. So he was buried with a similar crown, with this kind of back flap made of metal on the back of his outfit, and so on. He was even buried with the little dog that you see there. So they realized at this point that the Señor de Sipan was actually understood to be that deity in some sense. So he grounded his political, his worldly authority in his role as the leader priest in the presentation theme. So he was perhaps understood to incarnate that deity himself. So there wasn't this distinction between mythology, things going on with the deities. That presentation theme was actually being enacted on Earth by Moche rulers. So there's this meshing of the cosmological and the very worldly here. So that was very exciting. And this was repeated again in another important set of burials that was found at the site of San Jose de Moro nearby. And this is a cemetery site that contains the burials of a number of different, probably several dozen women. It's just full of very elite, powerful women. And through excavation, archaeologists realized that many of these women represented another one of the characters from the presentation theme, being the priestess. The priestess character that brings the goblet of blood. And you see her little goblet here in this second depiction of her. This goblet here was also recovered from the site, and as one might expect, as one might see coming at this point, archaeologists suspected this might be the goblet in question, and when they ran a residue analysis, I want to say for hemoglobin, I got to check on that. They found out that this cup did, in fact, contain human blood at one point. So all these pieces are coming together. So we very much see that Moche leaders, different kinds of leaders, like the priestess, the main leader, all were fulfilling these different roles of this sacred drama, this sacred myth. Then we have a number of different other rulers, too, that have been found. There have been many at this point. And one of the more interesting of these is known as the Señora de Cao, the Lady of Cao, and she was buried on top of the pyramid of the Sorcerer, or Huaca el Brujo. This is the area where she was buried, again surrounded by beautiful murals. What makes her distinctive, obviously, is that she was a woman, and she appears to have governed in her own right, not as someone's queen, but as the leader herself. She was buried with a traditional Moche-style crown and with these massive clubs, reminiscent of the war clubs that warriors would carry into battle. She also sports a nice nose ring, which many of the Moche leaders wore. It's an interesting mark of Moche style here. And she's also notable because her body was naturally mummified in the dry climate, so she has these tattoos all over her body. And this mummy is now on display in a museum of its own. So, with the priestesses that we saw here, and then with the Señora de Cao, we see a number of examples of powerful women holding roles of leadership in Moche society. So I'm going to use that to bridge to a topic that we haven't had enough time to discuss yet, but which is obviously important in all cultures, which is the role that women and men played in different societies, and how women's and men's roles related to each other. So Moche artwork leaves us a great record, and it has many, many depictions of women doing all kinds of different things. We see a number of different kinds of professions, you could say, the women are involved in. Like here, they are acting as healers, diagnosing what's wrong with people. They may have functioned as shamans, as spiritual leaders. They also served as midwives down here, helping in the birth process. And then this pot here, it comes from a later culture on the coast, but it depicts a goddess, the goddess of the moon and of the ocean. Her name was Sea. I think Sea, yeah. So all in all, this just adds up to a picture where we see that these many representations of women suggest that the Moche did respect women and that women played prominent roles. So they were, by being an important part of social life, that was how they got represented in artwork and the important recordings of the Moche, as it were. And archaeologists in general think that, kind of by looking at different societies, they've come to the conclusion that the more women feature in society's artwork, the more likely it is that they played an important and respected role in that society. So cultures that have very few depictions of women, women probably played a less prominent part. Again, we see these little statuettes, which were common in households too. These are depictions of women with, you can see their unusual hairstyle too, and some elements of female dress. These were probably used in household rituals for veneration. Okay, so at this point I have to give you a bit of a warning before we move to the next slide. It is going to depict events of a sexual nature, but the Moche made it. I didn't make it, so if anyone doesn't want to see this, just look away for a few minutes is what I'm going to ask. So here we go. Okay, so the Moche made this unusual kind of artistic canon called the sex pots. Very, very, very punny there. Have any of you been to Lima and seen there's a museum that has a whole hall dedicated just to these pots. These are very common. Okay, we've got one taker back there. Okay, so I am just showing you the most innocuous of these. If you have further interest, get on Google and look up Moche sex pots. It's very exciting. It's very educating. But even though I make light of this, how do we understand these? Because these shock us. They confuse modern expectations of what people did in the past. So how do we make sense of this? Okay. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the Moche had a very prolific artistic tradition, and they represented all kinds of things, everything under the sun. They also represented people that had diseases and maladies. They were represented kinds of food, animals, childbirth. Just pretty much everything appears in Moche art somewhere. So it's natural that sex, being a human practice, would also come up too. Probably more to the point, I talked before about the circulation of fluids being an important cosmological principle, understood as central to fertility and the recreation of life. So most of these pots were made to contain liquids, probably a maize beer, actually. So the circulation of liquid through these pots, and notably through the genitals of many of these pots, were understood to connect back to the importance of genitals and sacrifice, and just this broader understanding of the connection of well-being of the world and the circulation of fluids. And this wasn't even limited to human beings. As you can see down here, there are mice going at it too. So animals are part of this whole thing too. It's just more about the world in general. I like these pots in one respect because they show that many of the things that we take for granted as modern, as things that differentiate us from ancient people, are not necessarily things that we invented. So the Moche were already involved in many creative sex acts. They weren't afraid to depict this. So it's an important thing in their artwork. So modern people didn't invent sex. The Moche people did. Well, they didn't invent it, but they're at it. But I also think they're great too, because I've talked before about how we often think about the ancient world as very humorless, like people were just into religion and worshiping their gods and building their beautiful temples and so on. But these are funny, like look at this one up. Clearly the person that made these pots was kind of operating tongue in cheek, and it's important to recognize humor and humanize ancient peoples where we can. Okay, you can open your eyes now, the rest of you. Okay, so I said these are part of a much bigger, broader tradition of Moche artwork. Think back when I talked about the Inca and stonework was representative for the Inca of this very refined and minimalist aesthetic. The Inca didn't invest a lot in flashy imagery and in depicting people and animals and so on. Well, the Moche are the polar opposite here. The Moche had many very advanced artistic traditions, and we know that these fine objects played a big role in Moche ceremony and public life. So metallurgy is a big one, obviously with the gold and silver of the Señor de Sipan, and there are many, many beautiful, extraordinary examples of Moche metallurgy in gold, silver, copper too. This is actually one of my favorite artifacts anywhere. This is a very large pectoral necklace representing peanuts, gold peanuts on one side and silver peanuts on the other. Yeah, this pot, representing another daily activity. This is actually represents the process whereby Moche metallurgists created works of art. So there are these guys blowing in these pipes into a furnace. So by blowing into the pipes, they raise the temperature high enough in order to forge metals. Pottery, obviously, was also very advanced, very elaborate. This one here is inlaid with bits of shell. Here's another form of pottery with these extremely fine, almost cursive-like lines. The pot that I brought in would be representative of this style here. A lady before class came up to me and mentioned that she had one of these portrait vessels here. So this is a very unusual kind of artwork for the Moche. These represented actual individuals, so probably rulers. Some of them even depict the same person at different stages in their life. And they have these very identifiable characteristics that mark them as certain people, like this guy has certain scars on his face in a particular place. So these were probably part of a cult that venerated the leaders, that commemorated them. And these are also important because they show us that the Moche could achieve very, very naturalistic forms of art when they wanted to. So we think of the Greeks and the Romans, and implicitly we just assume that they were the most advanced peoples artistically because their sculptures looked just like real human beings, even prettier. Well, the Moche could do that too, but for most of the time, they were interested in depicting the world in other ways, like this, in ways that were stylized. So these achieved a different purpose, but that doesn't mean that they weren't capable of carrying out these great, of accomplishing these kinds of works too. Okay, and then we see more kinds of plants and animals that were depicted in the artwork, like this little crab up here. This is another peanut and a gourd, so very, very lifelike in other ways too. Another thing that comes up in their artwork are these wrinkly hairless dogs. And if any of you have been to an archaeological site on the Peruvian coast, you may have run into one of them. This is what they look like in real life. These are actually national patrimony, this breed of dog. And they're protected by law. So every archaeological site on the coast legally has to have a resident hairless dog there to help protect the breed. Some archaeologists have been known to like these dogs so much that they may have adopted one and brought it home with them. I'm not going to name names here. But they're very interesting because they demonstrate a bigger point, is that peoples all over the New World were breeding dogs too. So we tend to think in very dry terms like, oh, did they, native peoples domesticated the llama and they domesticated the turkey, these important food animals. But they're also domesticating dogs too, just like Europeans, just like people that made the golden retriever. Native peoples made their own breeds too for particular purposes. So Mexico had its own kind of hairless dog called the Xoloitzcuintle. These are still around today. And then a number of dog breeds that we just, we may know on some level that they're from the Americas, like the Chihuahua and the Husky. We may know that they come from here, but they didn't just come about randomly. Native peoples bred these dogs for particular purposes, with a purpose, just like the Labrador Retriever. A lesser-known dog that I think it's pretty cool story is this guy, what's it called? The Carolina dog. This was discovered in the 20th century, just kind of wandering around the mountains of North Carolina. And the people that saw them realized that they didn't look just like a feral dog, that there was a number of these. And looking into it a bit, they realized that this was a native breed that had been domesticated by Indian peoples in eastern North America, too. So dog breeds are found throughout the New World here. Okay, so wrapping up the Moche, what happened to them? Where did they go? So the Mochi Collapse, like we've seen, was probably due to a number of different factors. on the one hand, there was probably conflict within the society over the increasing influence of leaders, the increasing separation between classes. The site, for example, is called Galindo, and running right through the middle of the site between the commoners and the elites areas is this massive wall, so kind of separating the areas, keeping the commoners out. So there's this perhaps a sense of loss of control on the parts of the elites, and attempts by ordinary people to gain more power in society. And the site actually is associated with fires, so it was probably burnt. So there seems to be increasing violence within the society itself. At the same time, there's, in the archaeological record, we see evidence of very large flooding events, probably associated with severe El Niños happening at this time. So there may have been this increasing sense of problems with the going on, this loss of ability to control the environment in this very fragile natural setting. So things that were threatening the infrastructural base of society. And at the same time, the power of the leaders, supposedly these religiously powerful leaders who were able to control the forces of nature, increasingly it was becoming clear that maybe they weren't really in control of this. So, combine this to the resentment at the class divisions. Probably some kind of mix of these factors led to their downfall. Again, there's a main difference here with the societies we studied so far because we're very far from texts and the historical records. So this has been, these conclusions have been the result of a lot more excavation and conjecture on the part of archaeologists. There's no written records saying what happened to the Moche. But the cultures of the North Coast didn't end by a long shot with the Moche. And within a few hundred years, there were other even more powerful civilizations that developed in the same area. The most famous of these is the Empire of Timor. The culture is known as the Chimu. And they had their capital at the city of Chan Chan. Chan Chan is a very cool World Heritage Site that you can visit today. It is the largest mud brick city in the entire world. It was about 6 square miles, and this is the modern city of Trujillo laid out here. This is Chan Chan here. So you can see it takes up a large percentage of this modern city of 1 million people. So Chan Chan was a very large, important city. It was the capital of the Chimu Empire, and from here, the Chimu expanded to conquer virtually the entire northern coast. The Chimu also had this very elaborate tradition of metallurgy that they continued from the Moche and from earlier peoples too. And Chan Chan is exceptional because it's got this beautiful, unusual artwork made in mud and adobe. A lot of it depicts scenes from the ocean, where they were earning their livelihood. So these probably represent fishing nets, these diamonds. You have pelicans and fish and otters and things like that too. So it's a very cool site. The Chimu actually survived until the Inca conquest. When the Inca came from the highlands, there was a major series of battles, and the Inca incorporated the Chimu into their own even larger empire. So I think this is an interesting point here because we often think about the arrival of Europeans as marking this, very severe before and after. So there were the pre-Columbian peoples, and then there were the people ever since. But in fact, even peoples just in this one area had for a long time been experiencing the series of rise and falls of different civilizations. So even, conquests from outsiders had taken place when the Inca came and conquered the Chimu. So the Spanish, their conquest was different in some ways, but in other ways it wasn't different. And it was just, one more chapter in this very long history of culture and a change on the North Coast. Okay, so I think, that does it. So let me open the floor to questions. But I had a gentleman at the very far end of the room, so let me ask. All right, okay. I see a hand here. The burial of Sipan was found in 1987. Yeah. Okay, this guy.
Back to the Nazca mines. In modern times, is there any organization charged
Yeah, well, I'm not sure on the local level, but Peru has very, most of the countries in Latin America have very strong, like institutes of, in Peru it's the Institute of Culture. I think there are different kinds of bodies in other countries that govern these. So ultimately their protection lies with the regulations established by the Ministry of Culture at the national level. Yeah. And often, local people often have organizations too to take care of them. Okay, back there.
The Incas and this, in fact, all of the civilizations you talked about have extensive gold and silver. Where did that come from?
There were mines there in Peru. Yes, thanks again. So where did the gold and the silver come from? So you're talking about like natural resources? Yeah, there were mines in the Andes. There were gold mines, silver mines, mercury mines, and when the Spanish came, they used these mines. They exploited them too. Yeah. Yes.
There are some similarities between these cultures and the Egyptian. Is it thought that it's just a sort of primitive aspect, or was there thinking that there may have been some communication?
Yeah, so the question is if some similarities with the Egyptians might indicate actual interaction or just different developments. There has been no evidence ever for any traffic with ancient Egypt. The similarities that they share with the Egyptian, if we could study ancient Asia or ancient Africa or ancient Europe too, we'd get a lot of these things just appear over and over in different civilizations around the world. So that's the most we can say right now. Okay, back there.
We had a gentleman, professor from Vanderbilt, who lectured about Antarctica,
Mm-hmm.
and he did archaeology work in Peru. Did you all work together? Or?
I don't know. What's his name?
Dan Morgan.
I don't know his name. No.
You
Sorry.
Vanderbilt professors need to talk to each other.
Well, what field is he in now?
Archaeology.
Geology. Oh, he might. Yeah, I know there's someone in geology that has worked with a number of the professors here, so that could have been him. Yeah, I personally don't know him, but yeah, there are a lot of geologists that are involved in archaeological work, like with the studying things like the flooding, the El Nino flooding, for instance, things like that. Yeah.
Do you have an idea of what the succession of rulers was like in the Moche culture?
No, okay. Do you mean like names of people or the principles of?
It's just a method of
Yeah,
power.
that's one thing that is very difficult to tell without writing, without written text. So with the Maya, we were able to get a really good sense of that because they, ad nauseum tracked the sequence of their rulers, of their dynasties. But with the Moche, that's not something that people have been able to figure out. And it would be a difficult thing to do. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir, back here.
I know there's a large population of Orientals in Chile and Peru nowadays. In fact, has it reached majority level yet? And that's one of the questions. When did you stumble across Oriental archaeology?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first question very well.
Okay. I think in Peru and Chile, there are large populations of Orientals, Japanese,
Oh.
Koreans, maybe. I'm not. I think Japanese mainly.
Mhm.
Have you run across early Japanese archaeological sites to date them to the
Oh, okay. Okay, I see the question.
over here?
Okay, so the question is, there are a lot of populations of Chinese and Japanese people in Peru, Chile. So the question is basically how long this goes back, and if we see this in archaeology too. No, actually, we know for sure. I think a lot of these communities came over, like in the U.S., to build railroads. As voluntary laborers in the 19th century in particular. But you're right. There's culturally, there's a very important presence of Japanese people and of Chinese people. Speaking from my perspective, in Peru at least, you see that a lot. It's not a large percentage of the population, but they have a very prominent presence, like President Fujimori, for instance. So, and in the food and the cuisine, too. There's great Chinese influence. Ma'am, back there. Like the green? Yeah, that's inlaid stone. That's turquoise, I think, in that instance. And there's shell and coral were inlaid too. Yeah. Yeah, sir, back there. Yeah, the Moche and the Nazca are actually contemporary groups. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so the question is where the Nazca and where the Moche came from. Everyone, all these people descended ultimately from people that came, for the most part, from people that came from Asia. So you're kind of getting a partial vision just by the way the course is structured, because I'm talking about the Moche, I'm talking about the Nazca, but for every group that I've picked, I could talk about many, many other groups that were flourishing at the same time. They're very near neighbors. So there were so many of these different groups, and just kind of at different points in time and at different places, they kind of came together and formed more complex cultural and artistic, formations. Okay, ma'am, here.
Thought of this when he asked his question. We talk about what happened to all these civilizations, but we never talk about what makes a civilization rise. And when he said where do they come from, that was my interpretation, not where do the people come from, but why do they form? Is it one leader? Is it,
Yeah, okay, yes. Thanks for pointing that out. I got that's. Yeah, a way I've been doing the classes, but I haven't focused much on that. So the question is, every class I've been focusing on how they collapsed, but not as much on how the culture developed, how it rose in the first place. That, to answer you, much of archaeology is about this very question, because obviously this is something that we don't have analogies with in the modern world to make sense of how civilizations develop. So this is one of the things that literally no one can get at except for archaeologists. This is deeply in the past. So there are a lot of ways that have been answered, that people have answered that. What comes to mind, two different viewpoints are that there are people that are of the mind that the same kinds of factors were at work all across the world in every civilization. Most of those people would argue that when agriculture developed in a certain area, that people eventually were able to produce much more food, extra food, and then with that extra food, they were able to support people who weren't farmers that could concentrate on art or just be kind of the parasites that ruled and took the produce of society. So that's a very common model that's applied to explain the emergence of many different civilizations. Then there are other archaeologists who would adhere to the idea that it's different in every single context, and it might result from just particular individuals having a very influential role in history. It might result from different kinds of religious beliefs or understandings of the universe that might play into that. It might be due to environmental changes, like cooling and warming episodes in relationship to the ice age, or smaller ice ages and things like that. So there are a lot of ways that have been answered, and I don't have time to go into that for the cultures we've studied so far, but yeah, I'll keep that in mind starting next week and kind of focus more on that too. Yeah. Yes, right here.
Why do people have to come from somewhere else? Why couldn't they have originated right there?
Yes, okay, so the question is why do we assume that Native Americans had to come from elsewhere?
Right.
Well, you wouldn't have to, but this, based on genetics and based on linguistic evidence too, there are extremely close similarities between all Native American peoples and peoples that lived in Siberia and northeastern Asia. So it comes out of the science. If you start with the idea that humans originated in Africa and then moved from there across the world, that's part of the movement eastward comes from there. So obviously, this is amongst a lot of Native Americans in North America have very strong objections to this. Much like people who believe in young Earth creationism, don't see this conflict with the scientific narrative and their own beliefs. So this is obviously something that is contentious, and people believe, I've lived here in Tennessee, or my peoples have lived here in Tennessee or Canada or wherever for forever. So I don't believe that I can't come from elsewhere. So that isn't that's a difference that's out there. But as far as archaeology can tell us, the genetic similarities are just too close to be a coincidence. Even like blood types are very similar, tooth types. There's many kinds of evidence that link people to northeastern Asia too. This isn't to say they didn't come from China. We're talking 20,000, 30,000 years ago. We don't know how far this is. So at that time, the peoples in Asia were completely different too. They weren't the modern Asians. So, yeah. Over there, ma'am.
Is there any significance to that spout handle, just besides the practicality? Because I thought on
Mm-hmm.
different.
Yeah, the significance of it, we could conjecture. I mean, it's just very, I brought this in, it's just very it's very typical of, what the Moche did. There's something about, the two ways for the liquid to get in and out. It's like when you open it helps liquid pour, like when you open a can and you have to poke the other side too. So that, instead of it being like that, having it be like that helps. But other than that, we don't know. It's just very, very typical of that area. Yes.
Some of these cultures that were existing at the same time, were they trading with each other, or were they always so hostile?
They were definitely interacting. There was a lot of long-distance interaction going on. Also, where I study is in between the highlands, like where the Inca were, and the Amazon. So trade was a major part of, society, and exchange played a big role in how that culture developed too. So yeah, there was a lot of not with other continents so much, like Egypt or China that we know of, but within this area, yeah, neighbors were in constant contact. And going back to Anne's question about the development of societies, other scholars think that interaction with different cultures often was a spur to cultural development in particular areas too. Mm-hmm.
South America, you said no, we found no evidence of them there. Did you feel like people you have found there were Oriental?
Yeah. Okay, the question is whether I would argue that the peoples in the Andes were Oriental themselves. I mean, yeah, that depends how you define, this sounds dodgy. That would depend how you define Oriental. The idea that people in the New World came from Asia ultimately, would explain why why people often are understood to look like Asians. Native Americans look more like Asians, so they look like Africans, for just in a very large, broad brush sense. So you could call them Asian, but they have their own culture. They don't really share Asian cultural characteristics in any other way. So, when you're down there and you meet Japanese Peruvians, they look very different. You can tell that they're not. You wouldn't put them in the same category as indigenous Peruvians. Yeah.
How about in North America, because I assume corn came from Mexico, and got clear up to Tennessee. of the pyramids here. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and so how much was there contact between North America
Yeah.
and Latin America?
Yeah, so this question is if there's contact between North America and Latin America. And I have this be the last question, so I'll answer that and then wrap it up. The short answer is there was good evidence that there were interactions between these groups, probably not very intense or common or ongoing interactions. Maize started in Mexico, and then it moved north to North America and south to South America too. As to the Cahokia and the pyramids there, that is going to be the subject of discussion next week. But yeah, actually, so the thing about the dogs too, there's also some good evidence that there were ocean connections between western Mexico and the coast of Peru, the Moche. So the hairless dogs are found in both places, but then there are other kinds of cultural similarities between the artifacts of these two areas. And these people were often very good seafarers too, so it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility. So the connections between Old World and New World were more limited, but within the New World there's a lot of movement, a lot of interaction. Okay, I'm going to close this down so we can let the next group in. Thanks.